Welcome to Rough Cut Fall 2022. I am Stephanie Ewing. I am the incoming director of the Water Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Byorth today. Patrick is the director, the Montana Water Director for Trout Unlimited since 2013. He joined that organization in 2009. He has a law degree that he earned at about that time, but he's also an MSU alum, having gotten a master's in fisheries, fish and wildlife some years before that. He's involved in a lot of aspects of water work in our community, and also serves on the Fish and Wildlife Commission representing Southwest Montana. He's going to talk to us today about the Gallatin, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. Let's welcome him.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm a little bit of a anomaly in our natural resource world. Am I close enough to the speaker, do you think?
I think so.
I'll block the slides. In that I am a lawyer, but I've never considered myself anything but a fisheries biologist. I was lucky as a young person to just know my mission. My mission in life came early, and it's been crystal clear. I just found that different tools were necessary to stay on mission, and that is just to protect and preserve the fish and wildlife and wild places of Montana. It's inherent in my being. So that's the way I approach the world, and it doesn't always serve me well. But I found that a fisheries biologist with a law degree has a lot more influence than either one of themselves. Unfortunately, I got away from things like doing fisheries research, which I really love, fisheries management, being out on the streams and handling fish. So I have to do that in my spare time as an angler. But in the end, what I've learned over the last couple of years of natural resource management on my mission in life is that conflict is the essence of our beings, right? And so today we're trying to answer the question, can we keep the Gallatin running through all these challenges? Whether it's, let's see, how do I advance? Whether it's climate change, rapid development in the valley, we have policy, legal constraints, all these things. Can we keep the Gallatin running? Is it realistic to stay on mission in the Gallatin or Montana and keep rivers running cold and clean, our fisheries and wildlife habitat healthy, and our fish populations and wildlife populations thriving? So it's a big question. It really comes down to conflict. Legal constraints like the Gallatin Valley, there is no new water. You can't get a new permit in the valley without mitigating that water, without balancing the equation. Although the system and the law is clear on that, we're not doing that. So that's one of our challenges. We know that climate change is upon us and affecting our water supplies. We know that water quality and water quantity are inextricably linked, right? There is no real difference. They are one. And yet our legal construct separates them. And in doing so, makes us ineffective in doing this. So it's all doom and gloom. But in the end, what I'd like to talk about is shift from the doom and gloom to it doesn't look good for the Gallatin to, yeah, it looks really good, because we don't have to follow the constraints. And if I've learned anything being a biologist and a lawyer, is that you don't have to live within the constraints placed by institutions, right? We don't have to stay in conflict over water. We can actually work together and solve problems. The law will follow us. We have to stay within the constraints of the law and keep testing and pushing and reforming the law, but we don't have to wait for the ship of state to make things better. Next slide. So let's start just talking about conflict. And I'm one of those guys that I usually don't use my children, but I just happen to be paging through and finding these great pictures that kind of express how conflict arises and can be solved over time. But conflict is so inherent in us, right? And it's to the point in this time when we can follow conflict every second of every day. Just get on your Facebook or Instagram or whatever you do, and there's going to be a troll creating conflict, right? Conflict is just constantly in our faces. And we have global conflict going on. We have actual all-out war going on in places. Locally, politically, we're in this crazy state of conflict. I mean, my life on the commission is nothing but conflict between, different users of wildlife and different approaches to conserving wildlife. And it dawned on me that conflict becomes a trap, right? When we're in a state of stress, resources are limited. We have a plague, we have a famine, we have limited resources. We retrench, right? We retrench to our clan or our family or our village. And in doing so, we isolate from each other in ways that actually don't alleviate the conflict. They tend to promote it, right? So you isolate with your village and they isolate with theirs. We're afraid of them. They're different. They define God differently. They look differently. We got to stay away from them. And eventually you can't. So one village comes in conflict with another, and it drags other communities into that conflict. And it's a cycle. And we know from history, it's crystal clear who wins a war? Nobody. It destroys institutions. It destroys economic systems. It destroys lives. So why play into the conflict, right? Why, or give into the conflict? What we have to stop doing is giving into the conflict and the stress and pulling back into a place where we can have a conversation and acknowledge we're different and we have different approaches. Next slide. So fundamental water stuff, the water cycle. The water cycle illustrates how conflict or how humans have divided up water to a place where we can't really make good decisions about water, right? Water cycle is pretty simple. You take surface water, sun beats down, wind blows across, we evaporate that water into the atmosphere. Are air and water separate? No, air carries water until it can't carry it anymore and it drops out as precipitation. Well, does that follow right back into the lake? Well, not necessarily. It falls onto the landscape. It goes through the soil into the ground. So can we separate land from water? Well, not really. And then it goes into the groundwater, and can we separate ground and surface water? Well, not really. They're completely connected, we found over time. So we've got this cycle that teaches us that water moves through time and space and landscapes and air and in a kind of cohesive motion. And yet we, as humans, we try and divide it up into segments. And that's really kind of the root of the water conflict and also the answer to how we can maybe get past the conflict and into some resolutions. So this is the actual water cycle in a political, social sense, right? It's the hydroillogical society. When it rains, we got plenty of water. When it's drought, everybody panics. And this is the cycle that propagates conflict. Well, on the legal end of things, the policy end of things, next slide, please. We also have a permitillogical cycle, right? Our permitting is designed to divide and conquer, right? Water quality and water quantity can't be separated, right? When water is low, water temperatures are high, the water chemistry changes so that it can't buffer pollution, like when water is abundant, right? And yet we've divided this up into different jurisdictions in different places where our permitting system and our legal system doesn't really promote resolution of conflict. It actually enhances and creates and propagates conflict. And I'm not an anti-government guy, but I just don't see it as the solution. It's the sideboards to what we can do and what we can't do, but it's not the solution. This is a great read. It's getting a little dated, but from 2013, Adam Schempp with the Environmental Law Institute wrote a great treatise about how we arrived at this place where we can't talk about water quality and water quantity together. And I think I tried to encapsulate in a brief outline, but what it comes down to is that there's a lot of people in the United States and across the world who think that we have to limit the power of government or it'll take away our freedoms. And at the same time, there's a bunch of people in the United States and across the world who believe that if we give all the power and resources to private enterprise or individuals, we'll lose our freedoms. And the truth is, across the board, right? We can we could lose it to private enterprise, or we could lose our freedoms to the government. And that's expressed in the construct around water quality and water quantity law, right? I won't go into great detail, but the basics are water quantity is administered by the state government, right? In our Enabling Act in February 22nd of 1889, we were given ownership of all the water as Montanans, and our Constitution expresses that. It says all the water, atmospheric water, groundwater, surface water, belong to the people of the state of Montana for our use and subject to appropriation, right? We can use the water in a lot of different ways. At the same time, the federal government, since 1972, through its commerce powers, has controlled water quality through the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, but through the notion that water does run downhill. It crosses state lines. And if you look at the Colorado and the situation in the Colorado River right now, it's not only leaving Colorado, but it's traveling through a bunch of states into Mexico before it reaches the Sea of Cortez. So the federal government has that interstate commerce power. So we've divided it that way. And then even within state government, or even with the federal government, they've divided it further. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is regulated by the Corps of Engineers, whereas Section 300, which talks more about water quality standards, is under the aegis of the EPA. So we've divided and conquered all, in spite of this kind of unity of water cycle, we've divided and conquered everything. So for 30 years at least, I mean, this is a 1992 state water plan document, we've all kind of aspired to this idea that groundwater and surface water are linked, and that water quality and water quantity are linked. And our whole intent has been to advance this idea in the state water plan. Well, unfortunately, this hasn't really been manifest so much in legislation as it has by the courts. Like Trout Unlimited, my predecessor as the director, Laura Zemer, took the NRC to court and eventually to the Supreme Court to say, hey, you can't just keep giving away groundwater without respecting its effect on surface water. So we're making progress, but the idea that we could sit back and let the legislature or the courts handle it isn't going to be responsive enough in time to do things, next slide, like address effects of climate change. So, you know, we could argue till we're blue in the face whether climate change is real or a hoax, and we can argue about whether it's just part of the natural cycle or there's trends that are clear. But I think if we rely on the scientific literature, it's pretty clear that the Earth is warming. If we look at fisheries reports in Montana, the Gallatin, we know that the Gallatin is warming and that trout are no longer able to exist year round. Once you get down below Headwater State Park, they have to move out to survive the hot, dry summers. So we know it's real. We know the effects are disrupting the water cycle, and the water comes in weird times and weird places in weird doses that we can't really predict, like we could ever predict the weather. But at least now we can literally go into a winter like last winter where we get a good snowstorm, you know, typically Halloween to Thanksgiving, we get a good dose of snow, and then nothing happened. Really, nothing happened with our snowpack until late March and April, and it came in droves, right? We know these effects are signals of climate change. Next slide. So, I mean, this year's just a classic example of what are the effects of climate change. We have epic floods in the Yellowstone, and if you track hydrographs and periods of record in the Yellowstone or anywhere in the state based on old gauging records, this is a 136-year record. And we doubled the highest flow ever this year in a year where our snowpack going into March and April was about 70% of normal. So you couple this unbelievable abundance of water, a rain on snow event happened right after Memorial Day, and boom, we have more water than we know what to do with. And yet we end up this summer, and one of my roles as commissioners, I have to approve fishing closures for drought closures. And we had over a dozen drought closures in a year that actually had, you know, if you average it out, we actually had pretty good water this year. So the effects are real. They're happening. They're in our face in so many ways. in the Gallatin, of course, and everyone's aware of this. I mean, our development across this valley, the Valley of the Flowers, that was built by beaver, largely beaver and water, is now being paved over with subdivisions. Where are they going to get their water? Well, the city is doing their level best to meet their demands, but they're not doing it right. They're not doing it fair. So we're litigating against the city and other cities as well. These subdivisions are on historically irrigated agricultural ground, but so many times they're not using that historic water to supply the homes. They drill wells out of the, groundwater wells that are exempt from our statutory scheme. And so one well, the legal theory is, a single well that takes less than 35 gallons a minute and 10 acre feet a year is actually a very small footprint. But then you think about the thousands of houses going in subdivisions in this triangle between Belgrade and Gateway and Bozeman, and each one taking 10 acre feet of water starts to add up. 10 times 2,000 is 20,000 acre feet of water, which is a hell of a lot of water. That's 10,000 CFS in a day, or about 300 CFS across the year. So it's a very real amount of water, and yet it's exempt from the system. This just kind of summarizes the whole point that we can't just manage, we can't turn our eyes toward one thing or another. We can't just manage groundwater one way and surface water another way, or water quality one way or water quantity another way, and expect the outcome to be good for us as humans, good for our community, good for our economy. Go ahead. So let's turn away from conflict and let's say, well, how do we get away from the conflict? Well, the first thing I think is we have to change the policy, and we have to do it through legislation and litigation. So I'm preaching harmony while I'm fighting it out in court. So this is one aspect of the work we do at Trout Unlimited, where we're challenging the cities trying to apply a new doctrine to Montana called the Growing Cities Doctrine, where it says, well, everybody has to abide by first and right. These are constitutionally protected rights, but cities, they're in a pinch, so we get to grow whatever we want. Everybody else has to play by the rules. We're also working on legislation that corrects this idea that a 10-gallon or 10 acre foot a year well is insignificant, so therefore they get a pass to the prior appropriation system. Because in the end, what that means is you're not just robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're robbing Peter and Paul, and we're all going to lose. So I'll jump into, go ahead, that's fine. I'll jump into some concepts that Trout Unlimited is working on, and we're doing it with many partners, and I see names up on the board that are people that we work with all over the state. And so this isn't just Trout Unlimited, but these are the approaches that we're taking as a water conservationists and fish conservationists to try and get away or resolve conflict in a different way. The fundamental principle that we operate from is that the use and allocation of water is really a three-legged stool. And just like any three-legged stool, if one leg falls, then it's not much of a stool anymore. It's a abdominal exercise instrument or something like that, So, and the three legs are the municipal or domestic water, industrial water, what we need to turn on our faucets and flush our toilets. The other aspect is agriculture, which is critical, not just in the Gallatin Valley, but across Montana. 80% of the water use has been in agriculture, and agriculture does provide food and a huge part of our economy. So if we lose agriculture at the expense of either of the other stools, we all lose, right? Finally, the environment is a critical part of that equation too, right? In-stream flow for fish. Why are people flocking to Montana? Well, we have lots of water and we have lots of fish. So if we cash in that chip, how do the other two industries survive, or will they survive? So it's a three-legged stool. In much of the West, what we're seeing happen, and if you track anything down in the Colorado Basin, you see this in spades, is municipalities, because of their taxing authority and lots of people paying in, in Bozeman, quite a bit of money to turn on your faucet and flush your toilet, they end up with this buy and dry situation where agriculture, as the owner of water right, are bought out, and that water is converted to domestic use. If you look at the Colorado Basin right now, you'll see clearly that at the expense of trying to get water to LA or Vegas, what's happening to agriculture in between and what's happening to the ecological flows across the Southwest. This is a paradigm example of where we can head if we let conflict drive our water allocation. Next slide. So kind of turning into the Gallatin Valley and turning into more solutions oriented. And this is these are just a microcosm of a lot of things that are happening around the West, and a lot of our partners that are up on the screen and in the room. We're really trying to just build resiliency into the system, knowing that climate change is going to alter the pattern and the place and the amount of moisture that we get to trade. The best thing we can do is build resiliency into the system. Let's stop arguing about whether it's real or not and just start taking action. And so I'll just take you through some of the actions that we're taking, Trout Unlimited and our partners, to try and build resiliency into the watershed. And you'll hear streams that, we're not going to necessarily talk about the Madison or the famous Yellowstone. We're going to talk about streams that run right through here, right through campus, or right through the valley that you might not even know exists. But our belief is that if each and every one of those tributaries is preserved, or at least conserved to the point where it can function at its best, then our chances of answering our question, can the Gallatin continue to run through the future, can be yes. So we're doing that. We have locally, the Gallatin Home Rivers Initiative is designed just to do that very thing. And we could do it in a lot of ways. First thing is connect tributaries. Make sure tributaries are connected physically, flow to the main stem rivers. Provide temperature, thermal refugia in times of low water. Aquatic life can adjust and move into colder, cleaner water. Especially salmonids are particularly good at navigating tough conditions and migrating to meet their needs. That includes physical fish passage in the sense that there's blocking. There's just blocks, culverts or bridges or diversions that block passage from one place to another that prevent that resiliency from happening. That ability of aquatic life to figure out how to survive tough times. And then on the stream flow end of things, we actually lease water. We'll work with water users, water right holders, and either pay for them to leave it in stream, or more often, or very commonly, people are concerned about the streams will donate their water rights to in-stream flow, and we'll take them through the administrative process and protect them as in-stream flow rather than diversionary water rights. So I'll give you just a few examples. How are we doing on time? We're doing all right. I'll go through a few examples locally that kind of illustrate this point of taking action rather than falling for conflict. So this is Dry Creek. It's a humble tributary of the East Gallatin River. It flows in, ironically, right by the little community of Dry Creek, just north of Belgrade. It drains the Horseshoe Hills. It's a low elevation tributary, and it runs through some old lake silt. So it's a really highly erodible landscape. On the image that you see on the screen, you see the light blue line that transects the screen is the Dry Creek Canal. It was built in the 1930s to take East Gallatin River water, Reese Creek, a tributary, Ross Creek, another tributary, water out to the bench along the East Gallatin River as you head toward Manhattan, Spalding Bridge area, you might be familiar with. Well, when they built that, they weren't really thinking about connectivity. In fact, they were really thinking about water rights, to be honest. And they just built the version right across the stream. So during much of the year, starting about April 1st and ending about October 1st, there was a diversion put up that captured all the flow of Dry Creek and conveyed it out to the fields along the East Gallatin. They didn't actually have a water right to take the water of Dry Creek. So working with a whole set of partners, including the local watershed council and landowners who funded a lot of this out of the goodness of their hearts and knowing that their property would be better if the fishery was functional, worked with us to do two things. First, we built a fish bypass so we could reconnect that red line, that dewatered stream. And so we'd have flow year round, and then also open it up so that fish could move back and forth. That means like recruited whitefish or sculpin or trout that were born upstream could actually reach the East Gallatin River and repopulate. And then in tough times, those fish in turn could move up to spawn and repopulate. It's building resiliency into that fish community by providing an alternative spawning and rearing place. So this is a picture of the fish bypass. It's actually pretty simple. We just put an extra couple diversions on. Above the diversion, we route water underneath the ditch would be on the left of the screen. That structure, right behind that structure is the Dry Creek Canal. So they can continue to convey their water rights out to their irrigated ground, where the water coming out of Dry Creek actually travels down, now reconnects with the Gallatin River, keeping it colder, cleaner. The next slide. And we also worked on miles of stream, over 2 miles of stream so far, and we have another phase coming up, where in Dry Creek, it was, if you look at the upper right photo, it's a little bit blocked, but you can see these high eroding banks. Some of them were over 16 feet tall, which calve every year. Freeze thaw and erosion would calve off these large banks into the stream, providing tons of sediment. So what we did is we built riffles higher. We laid back the banks of these high eroding banks, taking all that silt out and moving it off site so it wouldn't just end up in the stream. And we did it's connecting the stream in different ways, right? Now when it floods, and it floods early up there because it's a lower elevation of the southern aspect, it runs off early, often in April. When it comes out, it can spread across the floodplain, absorbing nutrients, absorbing silt, keeping the water cleaner, and soaking up the sponge, which is our riparian floodplains. And that water then, as surface flows decline, that groundwater is pulled into the stream, keeping it colder through later into the year. So this is just one little fairly insignificant tributary of the East Gallatin, but it's emblematic of the work of the Gallatin Watershed Council, the Gallatin River Task Force out of Big Sky, trying to look at storage, slowing down that water and storing it and building resiliency. So when things get hot and dry, we actually have a hedge against harsh conditions. This idea of beaver mimicry is very popular and now being more and more widespread. And it's actually pretty simple. It's just going back to our water cycle, right? In the upper image, you see a stream that's very classic, during the 50s and 60s, even prior to that. The idea was if you straighten a stream, engineers would tell us the most efficient way to transport water is a trapezoidal channel that runs straight downhill. But what we knew, or what we know, is that the mechanics of water traveling through soil forces a meander, right? It's the natural course of water is not straight and in a grooved channel. It's in a meandering channel that stays high on the floodplain. And so when we channelized and we let streams degrade, that means cut down into the historic sediment, what we leave is these floodplains high and dry, which means the grass is not very productive. It's not great for grazing. The only way to countermand that is then to dewater, take water out of the stream and irrigate it. Whereas if you restore that natural function by bringing that stream back up to floodplain level, allowing the river to spread out across the floodplain during high water, soaking that water into the sponge that is the wetlands and floodplain riparian areas, that we can restore things. We have better grazing. You have sub-irrigated ground that you don't have to dewater the stream to keep green. And you have better stream function, better shading, all the things that come into keeping water colder and cleaner through the year. Well, beavers did that. I mean, this whole valley, really, all those deep, thick, dark soils that are so good for agriculture were actually created by beaver, to the extent that William Clark, when he came through, he split off from the group to go over to the Yellowstone. They didn't walk through the valley. It was too wet. It was miserable. Too many mosquitoes. They followed the Story Hills through the canyon to get over to the Yellowstone. So what we're really doing is we're just rediscovering what the water cycle had told us, what beaver had told us about how to be better stewards of the land. And this is much less resilient. in the long run, a dewatered landscape where streams are disconnected from their floodplains, have very little buffering capability compared to a more natural situation. So that's kind of mimicking nature. Well, another way we've come up with, and this is largely a credit to the Gallatin River Task Force and their Sustainable Water Forum, is we work to use effluent, created a big sky sewer and water district. It's treated to a fairly high standard, I mean, state-of-the-art standard. But that water, because of this disconnect between water quality rules and water quantity rules, what they were told they had to do was use that water to extinction. The public did not want them to discharge their treated effluent into the river, which for good or for ill would be more water in the river. But what instead the rules made them do is use it to exhaustion. Basically fully consume all that water that builds up. And if you talk to the superintendent up there, he'll tell you that Super Bowl Sunday is the biggest day for a Big Sky Sewer and Water District. All that water was shipped up, pumped upstream to golf courses, and then used to exhaustion, irrigating golf courses to the point where they could use up all the effluent. Well, that's a cost to the system. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the numbers, but it's a lot of water that's not going downstream to serve fish or downstream agriculture. So what we did was one of our recommendations at the forum was to use snow or use treated effluent to make snow. It required a discharge permit, which the Yellowstone Mountain Club actually took on, and now and also had to change some statutes and administrative rules to allow them to build snowpack. And this is great because it does a lot of things. I mean, people get to ski on it earlier, but we're building snowpack. We're building water storage high in the headwaters. Skiers are happy. The other after effect of this building snowpack using treated effluent is the process of making snow and leaving that snow out on the subject to ultraviolet rays of the sun over the course of the winter actually further purifies that water. So come springtime, we don't have less water, we have more water going into the system, coming out at a time where the buffering capacity is higher, hopefully with reconnected floodplains that can soak up that water and service later in the year. And that water is available now for downstream irrigators and downstream fish. Next one. The final topic I'd like to talk about is one of our new ventures at Trout Unlimited. Rather than wait for the regulatory structure to accommodate us or wait for the market to accommodate us in trying to keep our Gallatin healthy through all this growth and climate change, is we decided we'd create with the Four Corners Foundation. Sorry, there's some weird animations, after effects in there. I can't seem to control. Anyway, the Gallatin Water Trust will be, with the Four Corners Foundation, will be an independent nonprofit organization. We hope in a few years, it'll take us a while to get it fully launched. And it'll be a forum for exchange of water. So as the situation sits now, go ahead, let's advance. As the situation sits now, we have a tendency to let the domestic, industrial, municipal water start to subsume both the other legs of the stool. And part of that's driven because if you're a developer and you purchase a 100-acre property to turn to a subdivision, right now it's very difficult for them to take that water that might have been associated with irrigated agriculture, use a portion of that water to supply the homes, and then do something else with the water, either to monetize it, make some money on it, put it back in stream. They can make money that way, donate it to in-stream flow. There's all these options out there that are available, but the statutes and the administrative structure tends to dissuade them from taking that pathway. The Water Trust will provide a forum for them to do that. It'll provide expertise. If I do my job right, it'll have funding to help purchase and transfer water to in-stream flow, propagate the river flow, which also helps agriculture, or B, to exchange water between uses more effectively. There's two problems right now that hold us back. One is the process to change a water right from one use to another is fraught. It takes a lot of time. It's very unpredictable what the outcome might be, and it's very expensive. So rather than take your water right through a change process, it's much easier to hit the easy button. Let's go ahead and switch over, and that's to use exempt wells, permit exempt wells. You just skirt the whole system, drill a bunch of wells, supply the houses that way, but what do you do with that irrigation right? And in most cases, that water is still being diverted out of the river. There's two very large old canals that actually irrigate part of campus that run through now miles of subdivisions where they used to run through miles of agricultural ground that was irrigated, and it was flood irrigated, so it recharged the aquifer. It was actually part of a actual fairly functional system that's dewatered the river, but it also recharged the aquifer in a way that there was some sort of balance. Well, now we have this easy button, so you can hold on to your water right. It's continue to divert from the river and use exempt wells instead. And so you kind of get your cake and eat it too. At the same time, the city's trying to grow, right? It's trying to grow its infrastructure along with its water supply, and it's bumping up against these same problems. It's very expensive to upgrade your water treatment plant. I think the last one was $16 million, and the next one's probably going to be twice that to just keep up with water quality standards and keep up with water supply. So we're bumping up against a system that isn't that functional at this point. As I said, the process to change water rights is very complicated, expensive, and unpredictable. The NRC deserves a lot of credit, and as does the governor, for advancing a process, creating a stakeholders group of ag and industry, conservation. I represent conservation, to try and come up with ideas to reform the process. So it's not such an ogre that we keep trying to hit the easy button and go around it. So I'm criticizing the NRC's process, but at the same time, I want to give them credit because they're actually making gains on this, and we're moving forward. Okay, next slide. So what's the idea behind the water trust? Well, if we could create an economically efficient means of transferring between uses, rather than pocketing and continuing to divert water, we could start exchanging that water in a way that acknowledges the three-legged stool. Yeah, Bozeman's going to grow. People are going to need water. Fish still need water, and agriculture is still an important social, economic staple of our valley. Can we balance those three out? Well, we can if we can exchange water between uses. So the trust will either broker transactions between people. The trust will actually accept donations or purchase water for key locations, portion of which will go in stream either as beneficial use of in-stream flow and protected or as mitigation water. And mitigation is all about when you drill a well and you suck water out of the ground, often that groundwater that was destined for the stream is now interrupted, but it's not just interrupted during the irrigation season, it's interrupted year round. And so late season in the wintertime, base flows are often a limiting factor for aquatic health. We can mitigate for that by taking water rights, injecting them into groundwater through wetlands, or discharging them out through ditches that we want to leak now to restore that, to keep that balance in the basin. So it's not just one of the stool legs kind of subsuming all the others. So that's the idea behind the Water Trust. It's just getting launched. Sharon Brody, my partner in crime, and my staff are working hard. We're incorporated. We're a 501c3. We've got our first couple water right transactions this afternoon. We're meeting with another water right owner. We're working with Aggie, the local ag irrigation organization, working with agriculture, trying to just create an independent forum, trying to alleviate conflict, create a forum where conflict isn't the rule, where we can make it an equal footing, equal transaction between whoever. We're not going to judge. We will have to charge, or the trust will have to charge an administrative fee. But for people who can't or don't want to pay a fee, we could take a portion of that water and preserve it as in-stream flow. So in the end, the idea is to answer our question, our fundamental question, can the Gallatin keep running through? And I believe yes. If we don't continue to buy in, go ahead, next slide. If we don't continue to buy into conflict, right? There will always be conflict over water. It's the history of the West. But we don't have to be held captive by the conflict over water. We can actually make transactions that work for people. We don't even have to like each other, but we can at least work together to try and balance the three-legged stool. So I believe, yes, we can. Climate change is a challenge. We can prepare for this, maybe not completely, but we can build resiliency into our watersheds. There's a lot of techniques, a lot of people out there, both online and here in this room, that are working on this in many different ways. We can do this. And finally, water management, I think in the end, will catch up. The administrative structure, the legal structure is designed to divide and conquer. It's slow. It will follow if we're successful. The administrative structure will follow, but we have to decide to lead. And it can't be just conservation or environmentalists. It can't be just municipalities, and it can't just be agriculture. If all three legs of the stool actually work together, we'll do this. We'll be able to keep the Gallatin running and hopefully keep trout fishing alive in the Gallatin. So thanks for your attention. I hope I left some time to chat about it.
Definitely, you go ahead and kick us off with questions.
Yeah.
There's a little microphone in front of all of you. Yours is lit up, but if you click that, then our WebEx people will be able to hear you.
Really great talk. Thank you so much. And interesting initiatives coming along. It's really exciting to see. I am wondering about septic proliferation in the valley. You talked about the sort of disconnect between quality and quantity, and I feel like that is part of the looming challenge for the Gallatin.
Absolutely, and unfortunately, it's not one of those problems I feel like I'm equipped to take on, but I think it's a great, it's actually analogous to the water supply problem, right? Is if people band together, like in a city or a sewer and water district, band together to throw their dollars together into the same hat and use technology to treat the water, it's much more effective than going it alone, putting in your septic system and your well, and that's the easy button. And what we're seeing is the expression in the Gallatin River. I don't know, just having observed it for over 30 years, I used to manage the Gallatins, one of my fish biologist jobs. It was really rare, except for right at the junction, the Big Sky Junction, to see algae covering the river in the canyon. And now it's proliferating up and down the canyon. So that's an expression of nutrients. And the geology hasn't changed, right? The Gallatin has very complex geology around the Big Sky area, but it hasn't changed probably for 150,000 years. Mm-hmm. So what is the cause? Well, septic system. So in the Big Sky area, as a microcosm, a more manageable chunk of ground, what we're seeing is the Big Sky Water Sustainable Water Forum came up with the idea of getting all the people on the canyon, along the river and highway, onto this sewage treatment system, and start taking some of those out. And I think you see the same potential in the valley as subdivisions are built. They're going on the Four Corners Sewer and Water District or the Ray Sewer and Water District, rather than propagating septic systems. Because septic systems, if they're analyzed individually, you just look at the soil and you say, here's the transmissivity and the capacity of that soil. Sure, they're no problem. It's kind of like an exempt well. Drill a well, and if you stay under 10 gallons a minute, we're all okay. But when you start piling them together by the thousands, all of a sudden it goes from a very insignificant to a quite significant impact. So septic systems are fit right into this discussion. It really kind of have to band together, be willing to pay a tax monthly, which can be expensive. But in the end, it's what's going to keep the Gallatin clean.
Thanks.
Well, I'm not aware of it. I think there are records the Department of Environmental Quality keeps records and the county planning office keeps records because you have to have sanitary approval to put in a septic system. So there are records. I just don't know if there's a centralized repository of that data. Gretchen Rupp, back when she was with Water Center, did a study across the Gallatin Valley and quantified some of that. I bet that report still, Water Center must still have a copy of that. But other than that, I'm not really aware of any.
I have a question. Yeah, will the water trust allow for short-term leasing also? And is that something that's allowed, that will, I think it's not happening on a large scale in the state, short-term leasing, right? So will it allow for like summer leases or for just a few months?
Yeah, I think that's part of the big picture, right? The law allows us to do temporary. You can lease your water in 2 of 10 years within certain limits. And so temporary leasing is legal. And it's just not very well used because it's still a prolonged process. So if you want to lease your water for 2 years and the process takes 2 years to get approval, it kind of throws that into the realm of impractical. So hopefully as the process improves and this legislative session, I think you can expect to see some significant improvements. If that all starts to become more efficient, then yes. If Farmer A upstream wants to lease some water to Farmer B for 3 years, we would be willing to help broker that transaction. In-stream flow can only be leased for periods of 10 years. So in that sense, if the trust ends up leasing water for in-stream flow, they're all in a sense temporary, although currently those 10 years tend to add up into 30 or 40 years on many of our leases.
I guess I was wondering about like even shorter term. I think in Colorado and maybe some other places they've experimented with, like drought leasing almost, like Farmer A isn't going to have the water to do a complete second harvest, then could that water be leased to, is there money to pay for it, like in, for a couple months to get it into the river?
Yeah, I think there's great potential. The only expression of that, right now the statutes won't really allow it except for through this temporary leasing process. But what we're seeing out on the ground, again, trying to not, stay within the law without being held captive by it, is drought response plans that are happening in valleys all across the state, where people just voluntarily forbear irrigation to keep the river running or to help their neighbor. So we have it going informally. It's the DNRC would tell you that's not quite legal, but it works. So trying to lead the charge and getting to that point, I think is part of the reason the trust exists. So I'd like to entertain that idea. Right now, it's not in statute or administrative rule. Man,
Great talk. Thank you, Pat.
thank you.
And I've got my drop counter app on my phone, by the way.
Nice.
That was a conversation. Agricultural usage, so much more difficult to monitor and modify. And I only know, perspectives on this, but if somebody has a water right and they don't use all the water, they have the potential of losing it, right? So is this water trust potentially going to use a portion of somebody's water right if they don't need it? Is that part of the
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the great fears is abandonment. It's, in Montana, it's like, well, if I don't fully divert and fully use it, someone's going to come along and take away my water right. And it's not a completely irrational fear, but legally speaking in Montana, it's very difficult to abandon a water right. I mean, it's almost to the point where unless you jump on a horse naked and carry a flag, I hereby abandon my water right, and run up and down Main Street, no one's really going to declare it abandoned, right? And so the fear is holding people back. And I think that's part of the idea of the trust is you create a forum that's respected. And actually DNRC will be supportive of our pilot. Well, maybe not an official pilot project, but they're going to be participating in kind of trying to develop the model. So in a sense, The legal structure can look the other way on some things, right? And as long as we build it so that we protect it. So right now, when I lease your water for in-stream flow, the statute says specifically that leasing for in-stream flow is not, cannot be used as evidence of abandonment, right? There's also another statute specific only to the big hole that if you participate in this CCAA agreement to protect big hole grayling, that leaving your water right in the stream cannot be used as abandonment. So we see the kind of the twinkling of a possibility there coming in. And we also see the DNRC actually being very flexible when it comes to those sorts of things. So abandonment is this huge fear, but a very slim possibility. And I think that's one thing the Water Trust could do in the Gallatin is to, you know, if you lease your water or donate your water to the Water Trust, that in itself legally is specifically evidence that you are not intending to. And so there's a lot of flexibility there within the legal constraints to get to that point. And that's one of our hopes, is that people won't, you know, hold on to their water right and isolate and protect it in such a way that it's both detrimental to their water right and to the, you know, the greater community.
So they can give away a fraction.
Yeah.
A year.
Yeah, you have to quantify it, divide it up, go through all the legal motions, but yes, you can do increments. So, you know, for example, if you're irrigating, one of our partners had about 170 acres in irrigation. He subdivided a corner of it and then switched part of that water right into more effective use on a very small, or not a very small, less than half of the original farm. The remainder of that water he leased to us to keep in stream in the East Gallatin River. So that's we could do partial, we could do full, you could do a donation, a sale, lease. All those are actually exist in the law. But really it takes examples to create the kind of the cultural or social change that will allow the law to catch up. Hopefully, in theory, yeah.
You briefly mentioned the ability of irrigation infrastructure like ditch systems to recharge aquifers. And I'm wondering if we get to the point where we actually want to manage that, how does managed recharge fit into a water market system?
Well, right now, and this is a quirk of water law, you have a water right, which means at your point of diversion, you can divert a certain flow rate to move a certain distance to your place of use. And you can protect that seepage loss that happens between point A and point B. It's actually part of your water right. Well, legally speaking, a neighbor can take advantage of that seepage loss, but they can't force you to maintain that. They could get a water right for that seepage, but once the seepage goes away, the water right goes away. So in a sense, these large irrigation ditches, and they're looking into this independently from a market perspective, right? They have a lot of water right now. It's changing. Their places of uses are changing. They're looking into this. So if you could quantify the ditch loss between the diversion on the Gallatin to Cottonwood Road, and you know that a certain amount of that seepage loss can be captured by piping or lining a ditch, for example, they could capture that water. The downside is that can only be used for a non-consumptive use. You can't take that seepage loss and take your 100-acre pasture and turn it into a 150-acre pasture. That would be against the law. So the idea would be, if you manage that seepage, the ditch company or the individual owner, having quantified through hydrology and engineering, quantified the amount of water annually that reaches the aquifer, that goes into the aquifer, they could actually monetize that and, you know, sell it for mitigation. A subdivision put in a big well, and they're on the hook for about 80 acre-feet of water during the winter. And we know that this ditch sits in a place in the geology that can get water to the river about the time they need it. They could actually market that water, that seepage loss, to the developers so that they could mitigate their new permit, their new well permit. So that's kind of the way the market works. And that's kind of the theory behind the Water Trust is right now, it's hard for the developer and the ditch company to find somebody that might value it, might change it, might do the analysis, and then help them market it. It just doesn't exist. And it's too big a risk for the private sector to take on and invest the money into creating the market. Well, that's why we're here. I mean, we're nonprofit. We can only do this by grants and donations. Unfortunately, we have some people that are really keen on the idea of keeping the Gallatin River running. And so we're going to create a market. We're going to create a mechanism. Got to do it within the constraints of the law, but we're going to do it and let the market operate. But if we can connect farmer A with, or ditch company A with developer B and help them broker the deal within the constraints of the law, help them with the exchange and the administrative process, then we think it'll be fewer people trying to just hit the easy button and put in more and more examples. Does that answer your question, or am I just badly?
All right, let's thank Pat for a great talk and discussion. Thank you.